Revolutionizing the music industry, the punk rock movement in the 1970s. Punk rock was taking over the underground music scene, bringing with them a crazy and violent way of life. The do-it-yourself movement brought drastic change to the music world, allowing anyone and everyone to produce music. People could form a band out of their garage, perform small venues, and grow to fame without the aid of a record company.
Grunge was a joke, Grunge was something we used to catch kind of like the flu.
Of course, so much change was not fully accepted by society. Punk bands met opposition in part because people did not accept their inappropriate and wild music. After many years, punk has woven itself into every genre of modern-day music. Punk has always been about doing things your own way. What it represents for me is ultimate freedom and a sense of individuality. The introduction of punk rock in the late 1970s was a major turning point in the music industry, allowing the public to produce music without the artistic control of record companies. Prior to the rise of punk, music was created to please the listeners, and musicians were controlled by their companies. Bands wrote songs to sound like what was popular at the time. Most music was uniformly calm and upbeat, which is what listeners had come to expect. Rock and roll was popular all around the world, with singers like Elvis Presley and the Beatles capturing the hearts of everyday teens. Their innovative style was not fully accepted, but it quickly became normal for bands to sing and dance in ways previously not seen as acceptable. The sexual revolution was the first major change of society's view on rock music. A wave of younger artists came into the music world and did not follow the rules previously in place about what was and was not acceptable to do and say. Their songs hinted at a more inappropriate style of life, causing an uproar within the music world. American society was very conservative before this moment, and parents did not think that their children should look up to these rockers as role models. Fortunately, the public began to slowly accept the fact that musicians and bands were creating music that was edgy and rebellious. Around the early 70s, the Paisley Underground began to pave the way for punk rock's beginning. A new group of artists took to the underground scene. Their psychedelic, folk rock-inspired style was far-fetched and very unlike anything that had been done before. Their music was pieced together from many genres, including alternative rock, West Coast rock, garage rock, and hippie music. This short-lived movement heavily influenced the DIY movement because it presented some of the first bands who were willing to do whatever they had to so that they could make their bands into whatever they wanted. The movement quickly faded because of its lack of popularity throughout society, and also its lack of promotion. Although a few bands crossed over into the punk genre, many broke up. Punk was originated in several large cities and areas, including New York, London, Seattle, and some parts of California. The term punk rock was used to describe garage bands in the earliest days of the movement. In the late 60s and early 70s, bands began to appear with violent music that was totally new to the music world. The wild nature of their music was slowly opening the eyes of the listening public. In London, bands including Susie, The Clash, and young singers like Billy Idol were taking the underground music scene by storm. All of the young bands took advantage of the UK's poor economy and political shape, using their music as a way to voice their opinions. The records created were as angry and rebellious as the bands that made them. Another major change to come out of the London music scene was punk fashion. Malcolm McLaren's shop sold crazy and different clothes and accessories at the time. Many mainstream bands of the time were what are now called concept bands. Their record labels controlled almost every aspect of the band and formed them to fit whatever was popular at the time. Music was generally calm, which is why punk, with its loud and obnoxious sound, was not quickly accepted into society.
All of these amazing bands that I saw, whether I saw prior to their follow-up album, was that this raw, visceral, honest, edgy incredibleness done really with a lot of craft. That was the difference, was like hearing the step from Bleach to this like crystal clear beauty.
Meanwhile, in New York, the Ramones, Blondie, and the Talking Heads were some of the bigger bands hitting the music scene. The first concrete punk rock scene in New York City came to be in the mid-1970s. Punk rockers took over clubs, and soon many of the small venues catered only to punk bands. New York punk bands all shared many of the same musical influences, which is what brought them together to support their new genre. Punk was and is still a very diverse genre of music. It pulls sound from garage music to grunge and about everything in between. The DIY movement made a statement of individuality for each and every punk band. They became the alternative to mainstream pop music, which was all very similar. Almost all major bands and artists of the time were a part of giant record companies, who provided them with the sources needed to form an album, but they also took control of the music, making it exactly what they thought the public wanted to hear. Because many punk bands were making music out of their homes with only the supplies they had, they were not controlled like most popular bands were. This is what ultimately made the biggest change in the music industry. The punk movement proved that you could record decent music without relying on the commercial music industry and its financial abundance. Punk bands made their own recordings, promotional posters, and booked their own concerts at any venue they could get into. This freedom from the control of the companies also gave them the freedom to do whatever they wanted with their bands. They could write the craziest songs possible, hold violent and aggressive concerts, and still become successful. They were slowly opening the music industry to the public, while making their genre more and more popular. People forget the punk thing was really good for women. It motivated them to pick up a guitar rather than be a chanteuse. It allowed us to be aggressive. The punk genre was completely open, not only to different variations, but also to different people. Before punk became popular in the underground scenes, the music world was dominated mostly by men.
All the guys already had bands, at least one band. A lot of people were in 3-4 bands. And the only people left were a few of the girls. A lot of the girls also were in a band. So in spring of '78, some of us girls got together and decided to do the Go-Go's.
Punk was different, allowing women to have the same access in creating music as men did. Many of the most successful punk bands of the 70s were the female bands, including Blondie and Susie and the Banshees. Women had the same opportunity to be as wild as their male counterparts. Also, men and women of every religion and race could make punk music, while before they were limited to certain genres depending on those factors. A major part of the change to the music industry made by the punk movement was its accepting nature. The fact that punk was a totally free genre was not the only thing that ultimately changed the music industry. The biggest factor to this change was how punk took control of every aspect of the creation of music and bands. Punk bands were not initially accepted into record companies because the genre did not fit in with what was popular at the time. They continued forming their bands and making music out of their own homes. They proved that a band could become successful even when they did everything themselves. This is why the movement was named the DIY movement.
We can best express what we want our records to look like, so we'll design the record covers. Instead of being on the phone to somebody who is lining up the engagements, well, we'll call the people up.
This artistic freedom was greatly important to the rise of punk music and also to the modern music industry. By about 1976, punk had reached its heyday. In both New York and London, it had taken over the airwaves. Although it was still not completely accepted by all parts of society, people had begun to catch on to the movement. The punk rock DIY movement of the 1970s brought one of the biggest changes to the music industry of all time. Because of early punk rock, modern-day musicians are able to say and do what they want, and musicians are able to successfully form bands out of their own home. Although the punk genre has been incorporated into many others, it is still a very important part of our culture. Modern bands like Green Day and Blink-182 are examples of modern punk. They both started out very heavily punk, but have included pop, rock, alternative, and grunge into their genre. Many of the bands to survive the punk movement are listed as major influences to modern musicians today. Punk has had a lasting influence on every genre of modern music. Although it is not as popular, bands like Pearl Jam and Soundgarden are keeping the punk legacy alive by continuing to mix the genre with others. Punk rock and its growth in popularity in the 1970s caused the biggest change in the history of the music industry.